so much for being here. My name is Michael Mack. I am a publisher. I've been very, very fortunate to work with Kelly Sultan. She trusted us to republish Pictures from Home. I won't speak too much about how important that book is in my life, in my history, but it is a seminal volume that in many ways kind of defines my approach to bookmaking and my understanding of what the book form can do in a combination of text and image. We spent quite a long time working together, considering what the next book we should publish would be, and we landed on Swimmers, which is a volume that was never published in Larry's lifetime. And we thought this was a perfect opportunity to bring together a group of people to talk about the legacy of Larry Sultan, not just through his work, but through his teaching. There are a number of his students in the crowd this evening, many of whom have mentioned to me the impact he's had on their lives through his teaching. The people we've brought together are a motley crew, I would say. Starting with Kelly Sultan, who is obviously Larry's widow and who runs the estate with great aplomb. Dru Donovan, the artist, who has also worked closely with Larry as a studio manager. Alec Soth, photographer, bookmaker. And Jeff Rosenheim, who's the curator in charge of the Department of Photographs at the Met. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hello, everybody. It's standing room only. There's some seats on the floor if anyone wants to sit. We thank you for coming. Michael, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be with this not so motley crew, very handsome and talented crew. And I thank you all for spending one of our best Saturdays here with us. And it's my simple role to share some conversation with the three others on the panel. And I will just say that I've worked at the Met for a long time. I started in 1988, which is, yes, 35 years ago. And we were part of the drawings and prints department. And we broke away around 1992. But before that, we met Larry Sultan and he brought some pictures to the museum. And we bought 22 of them. I can tell you that at that time, we had not bought 22 photographs in one tranche of any artist, and we immediately started showing them. I wasn't Larry's student, but I will say I was Larry's student, and some of the ideas that I think this crew will, I hope, share with you come from their experience looking at the pictures or interacting or living with the artist. And I just thought I'd throw out as a start just something that came from an interview that Kelly shared with us from 1980, in which Larry spoke about some ideas. I can't remember, San Francisco Art Institute. And just, I think each of us have some quotes, but for me the key was thinking about how Larry blended his own photographs in Pictures from Home with the photographs, the stills that he made from the 8mm films that he found in his family's archive. And he said, the truth is about performance. It can be staged and it can be found. And that he didn't see a division between the two. And we have two artists here, and I think each of them, might be able to riff on that. And Kelly might be able to share what that meant watching the artist's work in a different way. And whichever one of you want to respond, I think it's a useful thing to lead us off. Documentary, fiction, truth. Just small subjects. And however you want to answer it.
I feel like I'm supposed to start. Thank you all for coming. I'm Dru. I was Larry's student and Larry's assistant, and worked in the studio and worked with Kelly after. And I think preparing for the today, I was trying to figure out how to explain the pictures, and then it dawned on me that it's just, I mean, you all can look at them, but what I want to share is sort of how Larry worked and thought, and that idea of fiction and the document and the truth. Everything was always at play and in flux. I think to start off with, I'm not answering your question. I'm going to start with one idea I had coming into this. Is I was trying to understand swimmers and sort of revisit it in a new way. And something that came to mind was that Larry actually couldn't talk when he was photographing. And that's something that I can't actually connect to, because he was always reflecting. I mean, the process of working with photography was to reflect on photography.
He couldn't talk because he was underwater.
He was underwater, yes, just to clarify. And I also didn't know him at the time. So I was just like, I can't imagining him underwater trying to make sense, trying to make pictures and not being able to talk about what he's seeing and what he's wanting to describe. And so that idea of him trying to unpack this and like understand his photograph was key to his process. And so to me, always the fact and the fiction were interchangeable tools. And they were like more of a tool than the camera for him, I would say. Like the camera he was a photographer, but he kind of framed things more in idea and happened to be using a photograph or a camera. And I think just understanding his history of really starting, and Swimmers is a part of that, is his sort of early understanding of how to photograph, along with like all of the work he did with Mike Mandel, including just like looking at a lot of photographs that were already taken. I'm gonna pass it to you. I'm lost in my thought.
Sure. I mean, so when I first encountered Larry's work, it's interesting, that question. It really wasn't the fact fiction documentary thing that startled me. What it was, I was infatuated with this generation of photographers, older than me, as often happens, this sort of Stephen Shore, that group. But there was that Walker Evans line of kind of cool detachment. And then Larry's work had all this like heart, it was wearing its heart on its sleeve. And that is what got me. And that contradiction too, because it still had some of the look of that kind of photography.
You mean intimacy, a kind of intimacy that wasn't in the coolness of Evans or Friedlander or...
Exactly, yeah. I mean, not just the family dynamic, but of course the writing element as well. It's like, oh, you can do that.
Kelly?
I think,
Sorry.
well, no, sorry, we're sharing. First of all, thank you all for coming. It's very impressive that you're inside rather than outside.
Turn around.
Just look at this crowd. It's really a lovely show of support. So, as well as to have all of these fabulous people here to bring Larry with us. I lost my train of thought. What
Fact fiction.
Truth.
True.
Yeah, I think that Larry was just curious about daily life to the extent that he found it fascinating to find what people thought they were representing. If you take the home movie stills that he began with pictures from home, and what you could find if you slow it down frame by frame and look at what's in between, that he used to say we don't live our lives in these large moments of birthdays and graduations, but in unpacking groceries and trying to find keys to the car. And so I think that to restage those smaller moments when they're not being particularly called out brings that mesh between document and fiction and staged and spontaneous. And I think that curiosity is, and that love of the smaller things is what caused him to, it was a motivating factor.
I mean, what motivates an artist, and certainly what motivates an artist to devote multiple years to a project. We have two artists on the panel, and they are bookmakers. They have, created work and then consumed it, and watched how, as they were making the work, it was changing as they were reading it. And I think that's a very interesting thing. Metaphorically, I think Larry said something about the swimmer's pictures, was that he needed to get beneath the water. And I wonder whether, which is a literal thing, but it's also a much more metaphoric thing. And maybe Alec can talk about the Mississippi Project, that long journey, which is a water journey of sorts, and how you knew when it was done, and how many times did you think it was done and it wasn't?
Oof. So with this book, the essay is really fantastic, I should say, because it gets at the backstory of the struggle to make that work, and really touches on what I assume was the struggle to make all of his work. And you can feel the thinking going on, and wow, did I identify with that? Because you have an idea, and then you start doing it, and the pictures come back, and they tell you something, and it's not what your idea was. And it's this endless freaking process of figuring out, how you can make it work and still be rich with ideas, but it's not what you had in mind at the beginning. And that is, Swimmers is really interesting for that. And maybe someone should tell the backstory.
The backstory began when Larry was really a student at the Art Institute with Mike Mandel, and they were working together kind of in opposition to what the culture was at the time in San Francisco, which was a lot of bohemian discussions of higher art. And having grown up with both of them in Southern California, and driving down Sunset Strip and looking at billboards as the most interesting thing around, that really appealed to them, not only because it was in opposition to what was going on at the time, but because that's what they knew and came from and found really exciting. Larry always referred to things as Bob's big boy culture, which is what he and Mike kind of played with, and they were steeped in irony, and what their billboards represented and how to read music. Another project was all about commercial culture and found images and working with photography that already existed and recontextualizing it. And Larry actually then kind of got tired of that irony and began working with Swimmers in black and white. And it put it down very quickly because it wasn't quite, as Alec just articulated, it just was different than what he thought it was going to be. And then revisited it, as with everything with Larry, it has to do with an old girlfriend. Because a girlfriend was working at a color lab and could get him free processing. So he went back underwater, and inspired by a Red Cross manual that was also representative of the archives that he and Mike have been working with. And between the archive of the Red Cross manual and the color photography, he finally landed closer to what he had imagined. And Swimmers was born.
And it wasn't a comfortable project for him, I would say. I mean, physically, it was definitely about being out of control and also learning how to photograph. So he's submerging himself in water and has no ability to really locate himself. And even seeing is hard underwater. And
But
later,
did he have a fear of swimming as well?
he originally did as a child. Later on, he became quite attached to the water and would swim every birthday, insisting on being in water and lived around the water. But yes, there was early fears of water. And so, he has an unusual path. Like walking out into the world and taking pictures on the street really didn't resonate with him. And I think that's what I always connect to and sort of look to in his process, is how he he figured out how to ask a question through making. And so he needed to have sort of a cathartic, out of control experience, understand what the medium could do. And it also it scared him to both be under there and to sort of see what he got back. Because there was a lot of not knowing what would be returning when he processed the film. One quote I pulled was, the thing about photography is it engenders a lot of reflection after the fact. And to me, that is why he photographed, is that he wanted to be able to spend time in that understanding after. And then I think with Swimmers, what was challenging for him is he said so what began as an innocent gesture became a long suite of photographs that he was still working on for about 8 years, I think. And he said he could only actually surround it with explanation versus understanding, and I think that was the conflict with the project for him. It sort of, it became, to me, kind of returning to the idea of fact in fiction. When I was preparing for this, I kept thinking, it's all smashed together in Swimmers. He could not separate them out. And so in Pictures from Home, he had these different ways of working, such as photographing his parents' home movie stills. That's how that Pictures from Home started. He also re-photographed parts of his father's archive, either pictures his father took or different documents from his history and business, and then he made his own photographs, and he sort of shuffled them together with the text, which is this other sort of framing and photograph in that book. And Swimmers just gets collapsed. In fiction and fact just sort of get meld together. They are sealed and you can't sort of tease them apart. And that's where I think that work situated differently for him and held his attention in the process, but less in the sort of concept that he could access after.
Can I ask one question about his reflection after the fact? Because it seems like, he spent many years on this, he spent many years on Pictures from Home. With Pictures from Home, he's definitely reflecting a lot after the fact, and sort of not ending the project. And so, was he neurotic? Was he
Yeah, absolutely. But he harnessed it and used it and wore it on his sleeve, and was constantly fighting with it to gain some control over it. But I think that's what made him such a wonderful instructor and educator, and also an artist that was constantly, he didn't expect to solve anything. And I don't think he expected to end anything. I think he talked about he doesn't know how to end things except abandonment. And when you put something up on like an exhibition and he's walking through it, that's when you can see what's missing, is in that active installation process, and then finally feels that something is finished when he's looking at it through others' eyes. But I think it was the water that was a constant thread through, not through evidence and through his collaborative work with Mike, but swimmers began a constant flow for him of a way of entering something. In Philip Gefter's essay, he talks about it as an amniotic fluid. And I think there was something very true about that, in that he was solo and lost himself in the water as opposed to the collaboration that he was used to. But also, he was following parents and kids underwater and really looking at that relationship.
Yeah.
And he also began pictures from home. My son Max was reminding me just earlier, we were listening to old interviews with his dad that we had digitized recently, and he actually began Swimmers from Home, Max was reminding me, as a way of, with water. He had his home movie stills that he'd taken out.
It's the waterway to the next thing.
Yes.
It's the necessary thing that took him to where he needed to go to next. And it was the abruptness of change from what he had been doing with Mike. And it obviously needed it. It was a pathway.
I think it really was. He originally he showed Irv, his dad, home movie stills of the waterfall and his older brother and the raft kind of falling out of the raft or climbing in. You couldn't really tell. There was that thread of ambiguity that always inspired Larry. And said to Irv he wanted to pursue pictures of his dad in water and maybe get him swimming so that he could explore his father and choppy waters and difficulty. And water was really going to be that medium.
I think though, if you're in a set of swimming pools in San Francisco, and you're seeing parents teaching children to swim, it's going to remind you of your own childhood in a very visceral way. And also, just this idea of not seeing and seeing. So he used a flash, so he's got a mask on, he uses an underwater camera, just those of you who haven't had the chance to look at the book. And he uses a flash, and when you're underwater and the flash goes off, you literally cannot see what is actually going to be described. There's a moment of revelation and blindness, and that's a kind of interesting thing. And I just would say that must have made him think about his own childhood and also his parents in a very physical way. Just another thing, and I'd like the artists maybe to respond. Again, metaphorically, he said he's experiencing in the water, in the pools, the same thing I'm photographing. I only have 60 seconds, and that's because that's as long as he could hold his breath. And he had to hold his breath, and so if there was going to be a picture, those limitations were there. And I think that's, again, a very interesting thing as a training for what's out in the world, and with especially photographing one's parents, which is the next thing. How much time before they turn away, literally or emotionally or in any other way? And I think that certainly Dru has worked with even actors who are performing, and that moment, when is that moment and how long does that moment last? And Alec is obviously out in the world, and how much can you control it? How much should you control it? And when you control it too much, does the picture work or not? And I guess Dru has to deal with that too.
I'm just gonna quote Larry. I mean, this is like one quote that I use when I need to make any sense of kind of working with Larry's work and also guiding my own work. And it says, he said, part of the difficulty facing photographers is that almost any subject matter has accumulated a representational history. So to find a new discursive space to wander around those subject matters is a real challenge. If I know too much, if the narrative is too well informed, I am making pictures that are illustrative. And as a maker, that is not interesting. As a viewer, that is not interesting. And so that is like, that's the framework to me of like everything about Larry's work. And of course I borrow that idea as well. And so for when he was working, and the pictures that I worked with him mostly on editorial work and Homeland, his last body of work, there was a certain balance to the photograph that had to be out of balance. So something like ambiguity had to live in that. And I think that word can be sort of splattered over a photograph. But for Larry, that meant that sort of what was happening in the photograph had to open many questions and, you know, make us feel informed and still sort of continue to read. And so yes, he did work, and I also work in a way of giving direction or staging. But that also goes back to that sense of the open space in fiction that is filled with fact, that he just felt was the place to work. It was the only photography was a fiction for him. It could hold both that fact and also like open possibilities that he could imagine. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I also want to go back to the word neurotic, which it had the feeling of someone who is neurotic, but it was literary, it was long, it was narrative, it was his sort of doubt and vulnerability about his work and trying to understand it and make it had these like long conversations. And when I reflect back on working with him, it was really just a lot of listening, of trying to like figure out how to keep that openness and understanding in a picture.
Was he talking mostly to himself through you, or was he actually?
No, he was talking to me. I mean, that vulnerability part, which like I just heard Andrea Parlato's here, and she recounted a story which I've heard multiple times, is that, he was speaking to you. He would bring you in. Like, it was incredible, and he brought you in with vulnerability. And so there's this sort of action of teaching that he did over and over again, and it was in his grad class typically, and he made this picture of himself, and he made it when he was working on pictures from home. And it's a picture of him, and it's of this part. It's of this like soft under chin part, and he's wearing a suit and a tie, and it's very of his father, of Sultan. And he's like pushing his chin back, and you see all of his under chins. And he's performing. And when he's performing his vulnerability. And it's the first picture he shows his grad students on the first day of class. And it's this, isn't that, yeah?
It's like this artist talk, it's like introductory artist talk.
Yeah. And it's essentially saying like, this is me making, this is me trying. And there was this openness and willingness to show that he was always in this position of understanding and trying to understand. And so like, it didn't, like a true neurotic couldn't do that, I feel like. And so and then for me, I only remember 2 days in his class. And I can't figure out why I don't remember any more days, but there's 2 days, and one day was he like showed up with the dummy of the valley, and I was like 20, and he just showed us the dummy and asked us what we thought. Like, and I was like, I don't think that should be the cover, and I think you should move this. And he was like, he didn't explain why it had to stay that way. He like reordered it and took all the feedback. So like the conversation was always in this open place of trying to understand, and that's how he taught.
That's exceptional, you know.
Yeah, yes, I know. I mean, that's like the only reason I'm here. I mean, it is like, it was, it was, and that was it always. So he wasn't talking to himself. That would be, he was talking to me, and anytime I worked with him, he was talking to me and asking like for my advice, and I just couldn't understand how I happened to be there. Essentially just reflecting back what he was saying. But that was his sort of way of working. And then the other day of class that I remember, it was like editing my thesis, and I had my like little undergrad prints on, and I had all the feedback I had gotten throughout my education, and I was restating what people had said, and I thought I knew what it was all about. And he listened to me talk, and he just said, okay, let's lay it all out and just start with picking the strongest pictures and let the pictures inform the work. I mean, it's a pretty basic lesson. Most teachers teach that. But it was about learning how to read a photograph. It all came from learning how to read a photograph. So Swimmers, yes, was like this cathartic experience of how to make a photograph, but it was also to get to the other side of like figuring out how to like, what would be there to read.
I guess I have a question. Do you talk to yourself when you're, what is your process in terms of airing questions, and how do you answer them?
Well, I mean, I was asking that obviously as a neurotic photographer
Yeah.
looking for solace.
Yeah.
And he was obviously a legendary teacher, and so he had that gift of bringing people in and sharing. My process is different. But I am interested in the fact that you and I both have this thing about control and not control, I would say, as for sure Larry did. And you can see that he's setting up, I mean, the Valley is a great example where there's like, he's like trying to control it, but everything's out of control, which is good.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of that where I'm like, okay, I need some dogs to run into the situation so that it falls apart. But I also want to control it. But that's so different than the Winogrand, just like taking it all in.
Well, I had some bold-faced name teachers myself, and I must say they never expressed as much vulnerability as asking for advice on how to edit their work. That just simply never happened.
Very California.
It just never happened for me. The book. This is a book. It's a book that's a new book. And we have artists here who are bookmakers, and I think there was some discussion, and Michael initiated a suggestion that there was a choice of which book to put out and how to re-release another book. And maybe Alec can talk about, you self-published your first book in a certain sense?
Yeah, sort of.
So how did that come to pass, and who did you show it to? Was it other artists, family members, professors? How did that play, and what have you done? How have your other books, which are many, how does that work for you?
I mean, it happened because there was inkjet printing started, and so there's this tool. I had no reputation, but here's this way to make a small edition of a book.
Mm-hmm.
And then yes, I showed or gave away copies, and things took off. I mean, it does feel like with his collaboration, that work had some of that DIY spirit. Like, oh, let's just figure out how to do this, which is different than the published book.
But did you share? Sorry.
Did you share your book concept, the spreads,
With
like
lots of people around
yeah,
me.
yeah.
I mean, I keep things really close to the vest. I was just talking with Michael about this, and it's, yeah. I mean, one of the things, and I suspect Larry would agree with this, is that it's all about figuring out who you are as a photographer and as a person, and accepting those things and bringing them together, so that he had
for example, this conceptual element, this reflective element, and this kind of pure photography element, and he was putting that together in his way, and he had a teacher sensibility. And I mean, what's the worst is when someone imposes that onto everyone, because people work in different ways. Sure.
Kelly, did Pictures from Home have many maquettes and many iterations, and how many people were involved in its story?
Yeah, there were a lot of false starts and scrappiness to it, because I think part of that was because his model was the family's scrapbook and album, so there was he wanted to create an alternative family album. So there was a lot of back and forth with the design and attempts to figure out how to create that interweaving with his text and his parents' interviews and his reflections, and it was a messy process. Yeah.
I would also expand that his space of questioning wasn't to get an answer. Like, he didn't get confused by asking questions of people to get their input, so it didn't sway him. He was comfortable in doubt, and that's what he taught. Like, that's what he taught me. He's like, you just stay in doubt, and you can ask this person's, like, he wasn't telling opinions. It was just about to be in conversation. And so I could say, I think you should do this, or I understand this as that, and he would keep engaging with it, but it didn't confuse him. He didn't come back and say, oh, I'm gonna change it all because so-and-so thought this. It was this open questioning. I was also smiling because you actually showed me, we have like a familial connection back in Minnesota, and you showed me Sleeping by the Mississippi and Dog Days way before it was published. You were so sweet, and I told you things you should change because Larry had showed me the ballot. I was like, oh, well, I'll give you some feedback. And you were so kind and generous, and I was such like a goofy undergrad in your patient, and you were like, yeah, I'm about to get in this like windy biennial. I was like, cool, good luck. I mean, but essentially he set the stage of it being like, it's all about the conversation. So like, I can just jump in and say, this is how I'm reading it.
Well, I would just add to that I think, Larry was a performer.
Yes.
And that's why he was such a fabulous educator. And he was supremely confident inside with this, and able to play with vulnerability and without it undermining him. So I wouldn't be surprised if showing the maquette, just like showing the worst picture he'd ever made of his folds over his collar that was too tight, was a way of loosening up the crowd, of saying, this is how goofy it gets, and these are things that I'm uncertain about, and that's how you work. You work in uncertainty.
Yeah, so I'm kind of an obsessive compulsive reader of Walker Evans' book, American Photographs, which is a very carefully edited book of 87 pictures. And there are certain pictures that I just don't get. I don't know why they're there, and it just bothers me. It's like in the Bible of photography for me. Why would there be one wrong picture? And it's just, and I spoke to our colleague Peter Galassi one day, and he reminded me that it isn't a Bible, and that it's important to have a picture that doesn't exactly work in a book, because there's something there that they learn from that the next picture is going to achieve on another level. And that books have to have, hi Eric, books have to have these biorhythms, and if everything hits the same mark, it's tedious. And I will say that books are their own beautiful thing, and they have rhythm, and they also have, they can't work like just the best pictures. It's the best pictures from one perspective, and the right pictures sequenced from an equally important other perspective. That's better.
Making books.
I mean, if you look at,
That's how evidence works. I mean, evidence had to stay open enough. I mean, it's a really interesting starting place to make a book. And then you look at pictures from home. And its inability, it resists all information and like narrative art and doesn't allow you, it doesn't inform you. And yeah, Rosen also used the book from the beginning to figure out how photographs get situated together.
What books did he teach?
Only one, Walker Evans. I mean, I had like one specific class, and it was really a thesis class, but he would bring in Richard Billingham's Raise a Laugh. That's like the book. He had a copy of The Dummy, and that was the main book I remember
Wow.
walking there with him.
What do you teach with?
Evidence. Evidence. I mean, that's all you
Does
need.
everyone know this book? There are some nods. It's a masterpiece. Drew, you want to play it?
It's from his, I mean, I think also his early projects were a collaborative project with Mike Mendel, which is also, photography and collaboration aren't usually a starting, like, they don't. I mean, I think about a photographer being someone that holds a camera and works independently. And so to be in a collaborative process is a pretty interesting starting place. They worked for evidence. It's all appropriated pictures, kind of a word not even used at the time. Published in '77, and they had an NEA grant, right? I think so.
yes,
Yeah.
they got that's what got them.
I don't think they were appropriated. I
They
think
were
that's
taken-
appropriating a word that wasn't their word.
Yes, that's what I was.
They were decontextualized.
Yes. So yes, take the word away, but let me explain the process.
Yeah.
So they had an NEA grant, and they invented a company called Platsworthy Color View, and they had letterhead. And I think something that also hasn't been mentioned is the action of play in Larry's work. So like play, absurdity, trying things on. And part of all this discussion we're talking about of how to learn to talk about your photographs was like trying out an idea. And if you don't have play in that, then it kind of can't go anywhere. It's taking itself far too seriously. And so they sort of invented a company, and they had letterhead, and they had an NEA grant. So they said they have a national grant, and they wanted to go into different archives. And so they went into corporate archives, scientific labs, police, fire station departments, and they combed through, they believe 1 million photographs. They looked at 1 million photographs between Mike and Larry by hand. And they just started looking. And in some ways, this is like their early understanding of how to photograph and what is a photograph, and it's their education of photography. And then they started to take out from these different institutions, and these pictures were made to document different things, like crime scenes, experiments, different manuals of how to do something. And they took those pictures and they, again, yes, you're correct word, like decontextualized them from their original purpose or action. And then edited those down into a book of, I believe, around 57 photographs, and then sequenced them. And the book has one picture a page, and so you're thinking about, you're reading these pictures, they're all black and white. They were printed as 8x10s, very much in the format that they were originally made. They often got the actual printer reprinted them in that way. And then they made sort of new meaning without making any meaning, and stamped it as evidence, and as though it is some proof, some action, like some document of something. Also, I think a nod to the possibilities of what photography thinks it can do, create some proof or evidence or some document, and then published it under their name. So it was, you know, it was everything of not working out in the street and looking into the world in that way, in the daylight, but like looking that there is another world being photographed and there's a value in that.
And if you don't know it, it's an eye-opener. I think we have some time for some questions, and we have an extra microphone.
Yeah.
I'll borrow and pass it.
And so that people can hear, if you can raise your hand, we'll pass the mic to you.
Do you want to call and I'll just
Sure,
start
no
hearing
worries.
her?
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for standing.
Thanks for coming.
For sharing this. We talked a little bit about water as this veil, right? So seeing and not seeing. I think there's another element that really strikes me is this veil also being this. So there's, I guess, another element of not being seen, right? So from Larry's perspective, is like not being seen, or I guess not immediately recognized. Had Larry ever expressed how that veiling under the water might make the water a site of liberation, or like this liberating site? Or how might you all, if he hadn't expressed anything, if he hadn't expressed that, how might any of you interpret that work that way, or talk about the water as a site of liberation?
Nice question.
Thank you. I mean, I think he talked about it. I mean, there was kind of freedom. He talked about it. He used words like cathartic and freedom, and there was also pleasure. You know, it was and being out of control. He sought it to be out of control, and so situating himself into it. He was in the same situation that they were in, both underwater. Some holding their breath, some not. And so, yeah, he definitely placed himself in that. And I think coming out of evidence in this certain weight of working with photographs, I think it also conceptually worked for him to be in this space of like being out of control and have like the pleasure of looking and trying to make, and fumbling. Like it was a big fumble, and there was freedom in that for him.
I'll just add to this, because it's a lovely question, because that's kind of central to what interested Larry was, if you equate liberation with lack of control in some way. And he was talking about working in opposition to the control that he and Mike imposed on the world with their more didactic and abstract black and white involvement. And he said, on a personal level, I wanted to do something that Rilke says, to praise the thing. What do we have to praise? How do we situate ourselves, not outside of a particular subject or discourse, but right in the center of it? I know that in terms of my own work, I didn't want to be ironic. That was too easy. And so positioning himself in the middle of that and collaborating and erasing the immunity that the photographer has on the other side of the lens was a real through line for him in all of his work going forward. Swimmers.
Just another riff on that. I think you used the word veil. I think it's an interesting thing. Light as a veil, water as a veil, and this liquid experience. I think some people would see the street right outside as that same experience, entering it. It's veiled. How do you get through it? What do you see? What can't you see? What's around you? I saw this book and I was thinking, most of the pictures are not about swimming. They're about anything but swimming. And in fact, it's about breathing, or it's about many different things. But one can imagine another photographer trying to make pictures of swimming, but none of these pictures there's maybe one or two. And I think that again is sort of metaphoric of what this process was. And it's very much of an artist coming to terms with their craft and their conceptual problems of trying to make meaning
different from the work that they had been doing, and on the way to the next thing.
I mean, I know his work from, I know his work from swimmers. Am I not doing it? Guess I don't want to be. No, so anyway, I know swimmers from the beginning. I sat on his floor in the first house, and he just didn't know how to end it. He was neurotic, but he was so smart, and he was so open about it that, you know, I just accepted it, and that's who Larry was. And it was kind of charismatic in some ways. But the thing about the swimmers, what I remember, that the situation was that these were kids, right, that had some disabilities.
Some of them.
But isn't that the way he started out with those people in the pool? Did they
Started
were kids?
off with, it was a big part of where it went. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
It was a big part of where it went, but initially I think it was actually his neighbor that went swimming every day that he followed with her dog.
Okay.
But that was a huge, that turned into a big focus of his, yeah.
Because the crowding of the figures and what they're doing is also very important. I mean, they are so lyrical here.
Yeah.
They're really more about the body than, I mean, I always thought that, but just the crowding of the body I see more.
Yeah.
And the pictures, I don't know, you know, what's been done to them, if anything, but it's much more evident, and just sort of the theatricality of it, like that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
the choreographed.
thanks, yep.
I kind of think he knew how to end it, which was the beginning of the pictures from home. That was the pathway
Well, I think
out and into it.
what happened was, sorry. My theory is that he actually, besides the link that I already described about water and wanting to photograph his father in choppy water and swimming, he began with the movie stills. And that was by accident when they simply rented, instead of renting a film like you did back in Blockbuster days, they went to the garage and rolled an 8mm family home movie, and then it was seeing that family home movie that got Larry going, and he slowed those things down, found the stills in the home movies that, as we were working on the swimmer book, I kept getting confused between my Dropbox folders of swimmers and home movie stills, because they both have this incredibly dreamlike, grainy, otherworldly quality, and it would be shocking if he didn't resonate in some way visually with that seamlessness between discovering these home movies and blowing them up and looking at them frame by frame, and what he'd just been looking at underwater.
We have time for maybe one or two brief ones. I've got someone behind me and then someone over there, so I'll start with you.
I'm just curious about what was said about praise versus irony, those two attitudes, and I think it's a question for you, Alec, because it connects up for me with what you said about the line Walker Evans versus Larry Sultan's work. There's a kind of, when you're photographing, a difficulty about, on the one hand, needing there to be a certain distance, which irony is. Irony is a certain distance, or a particular kind of distance. On the other hand, there's praise or, I don't know, love or empathy. And it seems to me like in photography, one has to somehow negotiate those two poles. And I'm curious, and that's so hard and complicated and can sort of make you crazy. And I'm curious where you landed with all of that.
I love that question. Yeah, I think there are two poles. I don't think one is better than the other, and I think I think it's a matter of each photographer positioning for herself where she is on that spectrum. For myself, it was really, so originally when I fell in love with that tradition of photography, I was embarrassed because it was like, I'm gonna work the same way, and it's gonna look the same. But I kind of had to, I worked through that influence, and I figured out over time the little tiny ways in which I might be different on that spectrum, I guess. So that someone like Stephen Shore is very much a formalist, although there's like secret, almost spiritual qualities to it, I believe. And Walker Evans is a formalist, but I think there's also secret stuff, and other people are more, exposed the other way. What's interesting about the Swimmers, I think, maybe, is that his struggle was, it was almost too far in the field, that irony about, or that distance, literally like getting in the water and not having the same kind of distance. It seems like he was struggling.
The corrective was one step a little too far, or one leap.
I don't know, I just, in reading the text, the little audio clips that we've listened to, I get that sense, and hearing about the kind of criticism of the work that he was getting, and he hadn't found this sweet spot entirely.
Right.
Maybe.
No, I know, there's,
So I was going to call this. We're almost out of time, I'm so sorry, but we can do one quick one right here.
I was just wondering how the swimmers reacted to this goggled guy into the pool with a camera,
And a flash.
and a flash, like how the subjects reacted to it.
I wondered exactly the same thing while I was doing this, and I realized this is work in some ways like ballet that you couldn't do today. This was, Larry was not an intimidating person, and I'm sure he looked a little ridiculous. In Philip's essay, he talks about him looking like the Dustin Hoffman graduate with the flippers, and so. But at the same time, to have a stranger under the water taking photographs, it's remarkable that it happened, and I can tell you that Larry was not one to push, so he did not, I can't imagine he got any pushback on it, otherwise he wouldn't have felt comfortable. So, a sign of the times.
One more, Sally.
No, that was pretty much the question. I
Okay.
also thought swimmers must have been very surprised by the flash, and felt a little vulnerable and exposed. But so I just wanted to, did anyone know anything about how people reacted in the pool, like, what's going on? Because already in a pool, you're kind of in this other state, this aquatic relaxation, and it's wonderful, but suddenly, like, a flash going off,
It's not probably the same kind of thing. Light doesn't go through water in the same way it probably travels through non-water.
Well, and also, to Ellen's point, some of these photographs were done in the recreation center for the handicapped, which is what it was called, and it was in San Francisco, down by the zoo. And he photographed blind people. So, excuse me. So that was done, I think, during the winter when he couldn't photograph outdoors and use the flash. So, but still, it's inexplicable. I don't. Yeah, it's a question I don't know the answer to, but wondered myself.
And they also really remind me of the evidence pictures in terms
Very
of the
much so
quality
like
of surprise.
evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, and when we were editing the images, it's difficult to find those images that aren't so perfect, that where they're framed in a way that is not what you expect, but you're not seeing too much and you're not seeing too little, and they're like evidence. There's very specific qualities to
I
it.
can't wait to study them. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
On behalf of
I like this idea that there's some sort of straight line from praise to irony. I'm gonna have to think about that later. Thank you all.
Before you all leave, can I just say a few housekeeping things? On behalf of the bookstore, thank you all for being here. Thanks for squeezing in. We're going to transition now to some group signings. Give us a minute. It's going to take a little bit to clear these chairs, get the tables out. So please bear with us. Browse some books, have some drinks. We'll start the first round at 5:15. I just want to note you do need to have proof of purchase on your book before you bring it back to the signing line. So make sure you have that. And let's give them one more round.